Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women doing amazing work around the world. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Today is a special episode for me since I'm joined by Rachel Kyte, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School, where I am an alum. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Emily, thank you for the invitation.
So today we're going to be covering climate change. Climate change is intimately linked to gender. It increases gender equality, reduces women's ability to be financially independent, and negatively impacts the social and political rights of women, particularly in economies heavily based on agriculture. So how can the US address the problem of climate change through a feminist lens?
Well, you're right that the impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on the vulnerable, and in many societies, the vulnerable has a female face on it, certainly for women and children across the world. And that's true domestically as it is internationally. You may be a single mother living in one of the big cities of the country and really experiencing the heat island effect with nowhere to go to get cool and nowhere to make sure that your kid can stay cool after they come out of school. So the vulnerable and the poor and the female face on that is a phenomenon which is just exacerbated by climate change. And so as we try to build more resilience and we try to adapt to the impacts of climate change now, and we use the recovery from the economic crisis caused by COVID-19, we have to have that feminist perspective in the way in which we think about how to build that resilience. And here we're helped by science and by scholarship, in that we know that many communities are much stronger where we understand that it is women that hold the sort of social bonds within a society. And we know that where we understand the social bonds held by women in the society, then we can actually help them bounce back better from a disaster, maybe a forest fire or sweeps through the region, or sea level rise and storms, etc. Communities will bounce back better when we understand how to invest in women, because they form the social bonds that underpin the community. So yes, women are at more risk, but women are a big part of the solution, and that has to filter through all of the policy discussions this year.
I think that framing is incredibly important, of not just portraying women as victims, but they are also part of the solution to the problem. So thank you for bringing that up. It's been, or it will be, a big year for the UK. They have the presidency of the G7, where one of the main focuses is on climate change and biodiversity. And then the COP26 is taking place in Scotland. How can the UK capitalize on these events, the publicity surrounding them, and what concrete climate actions do you hope to see come from them?
So you're right. This is an extraordinary opportunity for the United Kingdom to host the G7 and a COP26, the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in November. It's also an extraordinary opportunity for Italy, who are co-hosts of the COP, but also are hosts of the G20. So this is the year where we can start to really fuse the global economic governance agenda with climate change, because it is now one of the principal threats to our continued prosperity and the success of our economies. We know from a climate perspective that our economies have to decarbonize over the next 10 to 20 years. Countries are setting targets of zero net emissions by mid-century, and all of the focus is on what kind of ambition they can set for getting on that pathway by 2030. So for the G7, this has to be a climate-infused G7. What does that mean? It means that as the G7 discusses the recovery from COVID-19, that recovery should be green. It has to be inclusive as well, so it has to work for the poor, the vulnerable, and for developing countries. That means making sure that additional resources found for the International Monetary Fund to help countries that are in liquidity stress, that goes through quickly, and that those countries invest those funds in things which will help them in their pathway towards greener growth. It means repurposing the MDBs to be the multilateral development banks, to be able to help countries in their energy transitions, in their pathway to greener growth and more inclusive growth, and to do that as we focus on recovering from this extraordinary crisis. And it means that the G7 has to sort of put money on the table. There is a finance issue related to climate, finding resources for climate finance, but there's a much broader issue, which is what is the commensurate offer by the West to developing countries to help them grow green, when really in terms of energy and transport infrastructure and investment in nature's infrastructure over the last 10 to 20 years, that has been led by China. And most of that investment has not been green. So there's the greening of the Belt and Road by China and a commensurate offer from the West necessary. G7, really, this is the moment when the leaders have to lead.
At the federal level, the US government has been somewhat absent from the conversation surrounding climate change since 2017. What is the US doing now to seriously combat climate change? And what do you see the role of the US in the broader global fight against climate change, especially considering that the US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases?
So on the campaign trail, then candidate Biden and candidate Harris made very clear that they would re-enter the Paris Agreement if they were to win. President-elect Biden then doubled down on that, and then President Biden took the US back into the Paris Agreement. He signaled that he wanted to see a climate action plan within 90 days and indicated that he would host a summit on April 22nd, Earth Day. At the Climate Leaders Summit, which he then subsequently hosted, the US signaled the ambition that they would bring to a climate plan that they have to file with the United Nations. So they signaled that they would rejoin the treaty, and then they signaled the size of their ambition. And they've called for a 50 to 52% cut in emissions by 2030, which puts them on the pathway to zero net emissions by mid-century. So we now have the US, China, and the European Union, more than 60% of global GDP, all committed to a race to zero. Now, how to do that? Well, that's embedded in the infrastructure bill, in the jobs bill, and the Recovery Act. And what you see is a very strong narrative about the fact that good quality jobs and resilience and the recovery of communities around the country is going to be through pursuing clean electricity, cleaner transport, zero emissions transportation, investment in agriculture and food systems that are less emitting to the atmosphere, and all of the jobs that can be found in deep refurbishment of our built environment, etc. So there is a coherence between the domestic and the global agenda. And now we wait to see where the US will come out in some of the additional commitments and its engagement with the multilateral system to make sure that the US is truly a partner for other countries around the world. We've seen finally some indications of priority as well. I think the US has rightly put a priority on reducing methane emissions, which are a short-lived climate pollutant or a super pollutant. We've also seen some indications that the US will take these issues more to heart by signaling support for the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So most of what we see is putting the US right at the level of ambition that it needs to be at. The world is watching to see how all of the domestic bills actually make their way through the US Senate.
We've spoken about how climate change is linked to gender equality. How can solutions to climate change also work to address other deeply entrenched issues across the globe, like poverty?
So there's no escape from poverty without understanding the impacts from climate change that we've already baked into the Earth's system from the pollution over the last 20 to 30 years, and what's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. And so, ending poverty has to be done by grappling with climate change. And so these two agendas really become one. And so we are in an era of decarbonizing and building economic systems that will be more just on the back end of that decarbonization. So we can be more inclusive and decarbonized, and they're not in opposition. So if we think about the energy transition and we think about the 800 million people in the world who don't have electricity today, and that's just counting sort of the basic level of service that they would need. It doesn't account for the more than probably 2 to 3 billion people who don't have reliable, affordable electricity today. So if we're going to fill that electricity gap, if we're going to meet that electricity need, we are much more likely to be able to do so affordably with grid-connected renewables and off-grid renewables and decentralized renewable energy than we are by building centralized fuel, especially fossil fuel generation. And so we can use decentralization, digitalization, and decarbonization as trends that allow us to meet everybody's needs, to be more inclusive, and to be able to meet the planet's needs. That's what's exciting, but it's a very different mindset than the one that we've used for the last 50 to 100 years when thinking about energy.
This was incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on Gendering Geopolitics today. I had a wonderful time speaking with you and seeing you. So thank you so much, Dean Rachel Kyte.
Thank you, Emily. Good luck.